But first, a Ukrainian delegation has begun a meeting with its U.S. counterparts in Florida to discuss proposals to end Russia's war. At the table are U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner. The talks will focus on hammering out the details of the 28-point plan initially proposed by the U.S., which has since been modified as it was considered too favorable to Moscow. Here's a U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio speaking before the talks began.
We continue this very important work, building off what's been achieved, not just in Geneva, the progress we've made there, but the progress throughout the week as we've been communicating. Ukraine has tremendous opportunity for true prosperity. Obviously, you can't do that in the middle of a war like this, but ending the war alone won't achieve that. So this is not just about peace deals. It's about creating a pathway forward that leaves Ukraine sovereign, independent, and prosperous. And so we expect to make even more progress today.
Well, to take us through the events unfolding tonight, we're joined by David Smith, correspondent for The Guardian, standing by for us in Washington. We also have our correspondent Gulliver Cragg for us in Kyiv. And for some analysis, we have the pleasure of having the Wall Street Journal's Middle East correspondent Benoit Faucon on the program. Pleasure to have you all with us. I'll begin with you, David. Just lay out for us how the talks are unfolding today, what we know so far about the concrete points that are going to be discussed, and how long the meeting is expected to last.
Yeah, these are negotiations taking place at the golf club of Steve Witkoff, the Trump special envoy. It's just outside Miami, Florida. I think hard to know exactly how many hours it will take. That could well depend on the substance of the discussions. And there seem to be still two major points to clarify following the meeting in Geneva. And those are about territory and security guarantees. And I think clearly territory is such a central issue here and a point of dispute, because that original plan, the 28-point plan that was seen as very favorable to the Russians, that was calling on Ukraine to even give up more territory to Moscow and not seeking many concessions at all from Vladimir Putin. Ukraine and its European allies have pushed back at that, and the Americans seem to hear that to an extent. And I think today's meeting will really be getting into the nitty-gritty of what territory might be settled one way or the other. And I think, part of the debate behind closed doors is going to be on the direction of this war. We've seen certain US delegates here seem to suggest they think Ukraine is losing, and that it should cut its losses now and make a deal, or things are going to get worse for them on the battlefield. I suspect the Ukrainian delegation, with National Security Advisor Rustem Umerov and others, will push back and point, for example, just to the incident recently where Ukraine attacked Russian oil tankers, and say this is far from over, and actually Russia is making incremental gains at best. There'll also be discussion about those security guarantees. Will Ukraine effectively get a NATO-style protection, guaranteed defense from NATO members if it's attacked in future? And basically, we're going to await further announcements from Marco Rubio and others as the day goes on.
Yeah, indeed, David. As you say, a lot to hash out, a lot at stake. Now, watching this huge day of diplomacy from afar is, of course, Ukrainians. Gulliver, how are these talks being perceived by people in Ukraine? Are they waiting to hear the results with bated breath, or are they perhaps feeling cynical after so many rounds of diplomatic talks?
Well, I think there's a lot of confusion in Ukraine and a lot of alarm about the way the Donald Trump administration has been behaving surrounding this 28-point plan, which appears to have been pretty much drawn up by the Russians and then put forward by the Americans. But the Ukrainian delegation did say that at the talks in Geneva about this plan, the Americans appeared absolutely open to making changes that would make it reflect Ukraine's needs more. And the conclusion that most Ukrainians, or at least most Ukrainian experts, pundits, political commentators draw from that, is that the document that they will come up with, if it does involve any compromise, is not going to be acceptable to the Russians. So there are very, very low expectations here that Vladimir Putin will sign anything. A lot of people actually think that he wouldn't have signed anything at all, even if all of his wishes in that 28-point plan had been granted, because the way it's seen from Kyiv, Vladimir Putin at the moment doesn't really have an interest in ending this war and wants to continue it, and all he wants to do is to try to make the diplomatic track seem to be open in order to avoid getting harsher sanctions coming from the United States and other allies of Ukraine. So expectations are low. Assessments of what the situation is on the battlefield, whether the Americans are right to say that the Ukrainians are losing and might have to face a different deal that would be worse in the future, vary a lot, but they're academic in a way because most Ukrainians don't actually think that there is a peace option on the table at the moment at all.
And Gulliver, it has to be noted that these talks come, of course, after President Volodymyr Zelensky sacked his chief of staff and top negotiator Andriy Yermak on Friday. This news was a huge blow in Ukraine, and Ukrainians are still digesting the fallout, as I understand it.
Well, you call it a blow, but for Ukrainian civil society and for the opposition political parties and a lot of commentators, I think it's seen as more of a victory for Ukraine's independent democratic institutions, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor, institutions created to combat corruption after the 2014 revolution that toppled Viktor Yanukovych, a president seen as being just ridiculously corrupt. And those institutions are relatively small and underfunded compared to the government, the Secret Service, and the rest of the apparatus of state. And yet they managed to pursue these investigations and implicate people at the highest level. And then Volodymyr Zelensky ultimately, though he took some time before taking this decision, decided that heads had to roll in order to show that these institutions are working. And so I think they're just hoping that the world also sees it like that as proof that Ukraine is democratic, despite the fact that they aren't able at the moment to hold elections because of the war. And there's, I think, quiet confidence that the current negotiating team will be able to put Ukraine's interests forward just as well, if not better, as they were able to do when they were led by Andriy Yermak, who was reputedly not very popular, actually, either in Washington or in Brussels.
And David, just turning to you now, because also watching this closely today is, of course, Donald Trump, who will be hoping for, some sort of breakthrough today. The US president is obviously keen to show that he's enabled these peace talks to move forward. What's the outcome he's hoping for today?
Yeah, and I think what we know from Trump historically is that, he may see the departure of Yermak as a moment of opportunity. He smells weakness, or what he perceives to be weakness, and might think that this is a moment when Zelensky might be forced to the negotiating table to reach a deal. But yeah, look, ultimately Trump is going to be calling the shots here. Zelensky wanted a meeting with him in person, and that has been denied so far. Trump instead has Marco Rubio, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff speaking on his behalf. We've heard very little from Trump that seems sympathetic to Ukraine, and that goes back not only 10 months of his presidency, but during the election campaign as well. There was, of course, that meeting with Putin in Alaska, where literally a red carpet was rolled out. There was a press conference with no questions. There seemed to be very little sign of Trump asking Putin for any concessions whatsoever. And in fact, Trump seemed flattered that Putin was echoing talking points about election integrity. And in recent days and weeks, Trump now seems to view this conflict almost as part of a checklist. He will say he has solved 8 wars so far. This could be number 9. He thought this was going to be an easy one. It's proving not to be the case. And every now and then he seems to have a little dig at Zelensky, suggesting he doesn't have the cards, that things are going badly for him, that he should concede. And so I think many Ukrainian hopes will be pinned on Secretary of State Marco Rubio here, who traditionally was more of a Russia hawk, who does seem to have been sticking up a bit for Ukraine in the talks in Geneva, at least, and will try and sell that arrangement to his boss. And he does seem to have Trump's ear. He does seem popular with the president. And that, as long as Rubio is in the room, I think the Ukrainians still have some hope, because Trump, when he does turn his attention to this, and when he's not posting on social media in the middle of the night about Venezuela, he's not been particularly favorable to Ukraine throughout this entire conflict.
All right, David and Gulliver, thank you to you both for now. That's David Smith, the Guardian correspondent in Washington, and Gulliver Craig, our correspondent in Kyiv. We're going to do a deeper dive with an analysis now, and for that we can bring in Benoit Faucon. Benoit, thank you so much for your time today and for your patience as well. I'll start with the article you co-authored in the Wall Street Journal titled Trump's Real Peace Plan for Ukraine. To what extent is the blurring of business and geopolitics a feature of the White House?
Absolutely. I mean, you have, the lead peacemaker, the lead peace negotiator since the beginning of the Trump presidency has been a businessman, right? Steve Witkoff started as an envoy on Gaza, on the peace process in Gaza. Was then involved in Iran, trying to sort of find an understanding on Iran's nuclear program. And after the release of Fogel, was kind of this teacher who was detained in Russia, and which sort of Steve Witkoff arranged the release of. After that, he also became in charge of the Ukraine file. So you have basically a businessman, someone who was experienced in real estate, friend of Donald Trump, more, again with a base in Miami, as we all know now, who is in charge of all the peace, the biggest, most ambitious peace agreement that the Trump administration is trying to clinch.
And I wonder what your read is on the possible outcomes that could come out of the talks today, and the best one the US president could possibly be hoping for.
Well, there's an interesting process here where you did start, in Miami, in the meeting between two businessmen, and two U.S. businessmen and one Russian businessman, starting up with a proposal that looked very much, skewed on the Russian side. There was even a reference to a demand for, quote, denazification of Ukraine. I mean, it really read in some aspects as a piece of Russian, a list of Russian demands, obviously mixed with US ones. And now we're moving into a different direction where there's going to be much more input from the Ukraine side, and going forward probably more also from the European side, the E3, the UK, France, Germany, and European Union, and so this original bias is probably going to be corrected as things go by. Now that doesn't mean there will be a deal, but at least that starting point of a very much pro-Russian perspective of the talks is now sort of moving into a more balanced place.
Now, in your article, Benoit, there's a line that says, career officials in the office overseeing sanctions at the Treasury Department have at times learned details of Witkoff's meetings with Moscow from their British counterparts. That means that some of these talks with Moscow even went under the radar of some US government officials. What does this reveal about Witkoff's approach to directions or rather negotiations with Russia?
I mean, what we know is from a negotiating perspective, if we talk about the person doing the negotiation, Steve Witkoff very often, as far as I was told, was a team of one, right? He's a person who comes with a direct mandate from the president, and unlike the long, tradition of having big teams of people with different technical skills or linguistic skills, coming into these meetings and bringing the perspective of the US, for instance, or proposal from the US here, it's really him. He really is handling that discussion for a long time. That was really him. And then now you have, Jared Kushner's son-in-law, but again, you have a very limited group of people handling the discussion without really having a big technical team behind themselves. That is very unusual. That kind of is a break from tradition of potentially centuries of US tradition, at least decades, of how you handle these very ambitious negotiations.
Now, what can be said about Donald Trump's role in these peace talks? Because he's obviously put a lot of pressure, especially on Kyiv, to accept the US proposal, but he's also, put pressure to move the negotiations forward in a way.
Absolutely. I mean, this inception point of, you have three businessmen sitting at the, in a lounge somewhere in Miami. That's very unusual start, could have looked like, potentially conflicted. But in a way, what he has done is that he has re-injected, he has breathe life again into a stalled process. Of course, there's this big, mammoth potential incentive of $300 billion, of contracts, a lot of them potentially for U.S. companies. But remember, it's kind of a chicken and egg situation, as in this dividend doesn't materialize, and for potential investments for Vladimir Putin's Russia, unless he signs it. So, in a way, you do have some fuel, for that negotiation to move forward.
Now, Volodymyr Zelensky has said he's focused on geopolitical and military realities. What does he mean by this, and how do these talks fit into that?
I think the idea is, you don't want to have baked agreement, right? You don't want a deal that is effectively an interim, a prelude for an interim period between two wars. You want something that sort of locks in a lot of clauses that avoid that war to resume. And of course, the key one is security for Ukraine, making sure Ukraine going forward, is going to be protected and is able somehow to have clauses that deter any resumption of a Russian invasion. So it's kind of a logical, step to first focus on that, making sure war can't restart, or that there is no possibility of a successful war from the Russian side going forward. And then, of course, you want to deal with the reconstruction. But number one is, have an insurance, a life insurance that avoid war to restart, within a few years.
So we're seeing this latest diplomatic push by Ukraine and the US, but at the end of the day, will it amount to anything if Moscow ultimately rejects any revised plan that doesn't sufficiently reflect its own interests?
I think there was the idea you started a different approach to, because the previous one have failed. Of course, like you say, there could be the idea for Vladimir Putin that he can win that war anyway. Again, is the outcome he wants, which is to control, the Donbass entirely through military means rather than for negotiations. And also, like it was mentioned earlier, to avoid an escalation of sanctions. So maybe you're trying to buy time. So you may argue that there will be not a different outcome from the one, that would have happened for purely military means. But at least there was an attempt from the U.S. side. If you step forward a little bit, there was a moment that everyone watched in the White House, between especially J.D. Vance and Zelensky a few months ago, that went really badly, and you had the feeling at that stage that maybe the chances of having a successful peace process was unlikely. At least you do see a push from an initiative, in fact, from the Trump administration to restart an alternative to war, which is this peace agreement. So I wouldn't speculate about the chances of success, but you would argue at least they tried.
All right, Benoit, thank you so much for providing that context and analysis for us. That's Benoit Faucon, the Middle East correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Thank you.